The interactive shell is a really great tool for learning Python. It gives us immediate feedback when we type, and it's a great way to experiment with small programs. In fact, at the beginning of the course, it was the ideal way to teach us about types. We would go to the interactive shell, type in an expression, and Python would immediately show us a value. Now that was great, but that worked with the basic types. One of the things that we've seen with objects is this doesn't quite work so well. If I were to import intro CS, and if I were to create, say, a point3 object, and then look at the variable p, well, now I get something that looks a little strange. And while I might call this a value, it's very different than what we saw in the previous basic types. That 2, I could have just taken that and put that into an assignment statement. But this new thing, if I were to try to assign it to a variable x, well, now I get an error message because that can't be used as an expression. What's going on here? So the issue here is that's not a value, that's not an expression. It's something else entirely. This is what is known as object representation. When I have really complex things like objects, remember, they're these folder things, and Python can't display folders in the terminal. So instead what it does is it gives me a concise summary that helps me understand, well, what this object is and what is stored inside of the object. The summary, by the way, it's a string. You can actually get this string. There is a function called repr. It stands for representation. And if I look at the representation of p, oh, lo and behold, I see the same thing as a string. So what happens is when we're not working with basic types, if we type in an object expression, Python isn't giving me a value. It is printing out the representation of the object. And you can tell this because of the angle brackets. Anytime that you see the angle brackets, that is a representation, and it can't be used in an expression. You've actually seen this before when we were playing with types. Int is a literal. It's a literal of the type type. But if I hit return, Python actually displays a representation. Notice the angle brackets there. Again, if I use the repr function on int, that's the string. This representation function is actually really interesting because we can apply it to the basic types as well. If I want the representation of 2, well, that's the string 2 by itself. If I want a representation of a string, say a, well, this is already a string, but it doesn't leave it alone. It makes a new string with the quotes inside of it. Huh, that's really interesting, and we'll actually come to that in another video series. But for now, what I want you to understand is that everything that you were able to do with basic types in the interactive shell, you can't do with objects. And that's because when you look at an object in the interactive shell, the only thing that you see is the object representation.